Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And I am joined by a bunch of reprobates, or as they are more commonly called, the green team from the Legendarium. Hello!
Hello.
Hi.
We're usually only voices, so this is very different.
I'm sorry we're so ugly.
If
Yeah.
if you want, I will try to find pictures and I'll just put them over your face. Hide your identity, your secret identities. So that
We all
I'll
people
know
just
you
turn
can't
on
do
my
that.
panda again.
We've seen your videos.
that I don't know how to do things like that.
Yeah. Like
It's
sometimes it's just like a
cruel.
black box. Maybe you put a JPEG over someone's face for like 3 seconds.
It's cruel but true. Um, so we are gathered here today, uh, lady and sometimes gentlemen, to discuss the paper menagerie by Ken Liu, the short story from the collection, the paper menagerie and other stories. Because this was something that you had all said that you'd read and you'd be interested in talking about. So what I thought to do is, rather than me do my usual talking over people and dominating everything, is I would try to be more of a host this time so that we can all engage in conversation rather than it's not question answer or anything like that. Would that suit you all?
It's very
That's great.
generous of you, AP.
It's funny you should say that because yesterday I was like, this story is so short. Are we going to be able to like talk about this long? And Ash is like, AP will just talk enough for
He,
all of us, so it's no
yeah,
problem.
he's always got enough to say.
But no, I have some things to say.
I'm wounded to the quick.
I mean, hey,
No, but
at
I
least it's
enjoy listening
intelligent
to
things to
you,
say, you know?
so it's fine. I'm
There,
not
there are,
complaining.
yeah, there are a lot of
I'm
people that can talk forever without really saying anything. I
I
I'm
would
fine
just
just being a fly on the wall. I'm here for the exposure.
oh yeah.
Okay.
Mr. 7,000 subscribers,
well,
right?
if you want,
7,000 now?
yeah, if you wanted exposure, go and talk to Philip Chase. He's the fancy one.
We're
Oh, we
trying
plan
to.
to.
We
Boxing.
just
Yeah.
we're reading his book right now. I want to.
And I hope you all enjoy. So anyway, back to the topic at hand, you rowdy bunch. So the paper menagerie. So for the sake of people who haven't read the short story, it's a short story, but a very basic breakdown of the plot because we're going to do this just talking generally about it. So it's going to be spoilers basically from the very beginning. I don't want anyone constrained. But the basic storyline is this is a short story about the experience of a Chinese American young boy growing up with a Chinese mother and an American father, and the cultural divide that develops and transitions through growing up, childhood, wanting to be part of the dominant culture in which you're living, how that affects family dynamics, and how it harms his relationship with his mother. And ultimately, then he comes to terms with his heritage. But it's a very sad story, a very poignant story. And while it is specific to that experience, obviously, which I know nothing about, there are universal truths to it. Like a lot of great literature, it goes beyond the mere premise of the story and speaks to underlying truths. So I can't judge whether this is a true and accurate representation of that particular lived experience. But what I would say is it feels remarkably true and emotional and heartfelt about that experience and similar experiences. It's a highly emotive story. It is beautifully written. And I don't think anything in it is particularly complex in terms of the language. I think it is,
He'll be back.
Oh no.
like Arnold Schwarzenegger, he will be back. But I think it delivers a very strong emotional punch in all of this that you can readily identify with the narrator. that speaking voice, that experience. And as you go through it, you're living it with them. And I think it's a fantastically well crafted and beautiful short story. So that would be my opening on all of this.
I that was very well put, AP. And I would, my experience is not his experience because, you know, I don't come from a mixed race family, but I recently just had a child like a couple months ago, and he is a mixed race child, Asian and white. And I can't, I read this story for the first time a couple of years ago, and it devastated me then. And then I read it again yesterday, and it was so much worse because I couldn't help but think about these cultural divides and the identity problems that a child might like that might face. And um, you know, think I'm always considering these things living in another country from where I come from and being a minority, although it's not anything like what it's in the story, and I don't want to compare myself to that, but that felt very true. And even more than that, I found as a second language speaker, the what Ken Liu does, talking about not speaking the language of the place where you live and feeling as an outsider, and just how lonely and sad that is, also felt very true to me. And one of my favorite things that his mother said was that when she speaks English, like with her mouth, she said she speaks with her mouth, but when she says something in Chinese, she speaks with her heart, and that's so true.
Yeah, this was actually my first time reading it. I hadn't read it before we decided to do this. And I knew it was going to be sad because everybody tells me like, oh, I cried and it's very emotional. And so I was like, I was prepared for an emotional hit, but I did not know the content or premise of the story. So when I started reading it, I was like, oh, this is very interesting because I am Chinese and I do speak Mandarin, and my parents moved to the US when they were much older, but I was much younger and I learned English very quickly. But even to this day, my parents still have a lot of trouble speaking the English language, um, and being able to communicate effectively. And I, to me, I thought that Kenya did a really good job portraying the experience authentically. Um, and it was very interesting where I would pinpoint the parts where I could see myself in the little boy in that character, and then like reading it on the page, I feel very guilty. So there's that experience. Um, and thankfully, like for me, my parents and I, we can still communicate whether it's in Mandarin or broken English. And um, I don't have like that sad of an experience as the main character, but I do recognize that there is that frustration when you want to communicate with somebody that you care about, but you don't have the right words that they can understand. And I've seen that frustration on my parents' face when they're trying to communicate something to me. And I have that frustration when I'm just like, my vocabulary is so limited. Like, I have to try to use other words to try to describe it. So that part was definitely very impactful to me. While I did not cry, I do think that if this was something that I was like reading out loud to myself, I would not be able to hold back. Yeah.
Yes, I had read this entire short story collection a few months back, and like you, I found this to be a very sad story. When I read it this time, I was reading it out loud to my partner, and I was almost unable to make it through because it hits so hard. At the end, I just wanted to go and hug my mother. I don't think I've ever been as mean to her as Jack is in this story, but even so, there is definitely a universal experience here, even if You don't have the specific struggles. Every kid rebels against their parents, doesn't understand their parents, and goes through a period where they don't really see their parents as actual people, just figures of authority that bestow upon them food and wisdom and punishments. So that seems to be, as well, the specific nature of a woman that marries someone and then goes to his place of living and is completely isolated from everybody. That is also, I think, really common. It not this bad happened to my own mother, but something like that. The community was very ostracizing. She would, for example, bring things to bake sales at our local church, and people would be like, "Oh wow, that's actually good. I didn't know you could bake it all." She's like, "Yeah, I can do these things," and then they would continue just not talking to her after that, because she was from away, basically, and different.
And this is something that, again, like I said about a lot of great literature, the specifics of it may have a certain resonance with someone who has a similar experience and they can see themselves directly in it. But when something is well crafted, when it speaks to the greater human condition, there are all these other levels. So as you point out, the relationship between any child and their parents, of moving, even if you've never experienced something like this, but if you've been landed in a foreign country where everyone is speaking a different language and the people you're with aren't there, and that bewilderment, that because you have a tiny little insight into that, you feel a huge amount of pathos for the mother character. You understand her predicament, even though it isn't one that you have lived. With the narrator, the narratorial voice, that is far more easy to identify with, because we've all lived through that struggle, as you point out, struggle with the parents, the struggle of forming your own identity. So while this has a very specific case in mind, it is about this rite of passage that so many of us go through, where we're struggling to form, who are we? We are not carbon copies of our parents. We're trying to form our own identity, and that involves choice. And there are repercussions to those choices that we don't often see. And I think quite a number of us can think back to moments in our childhood where we go, I really regret ever saying that to my parents. And I can never take it back. It happened. It is part of our relationship. And it is something that helps form that relationship over time, that it's not all good. Sometimes there are some terrible things that you have said to your parents that really, in hindsight, you go, I was the idiot. But what is great about this story for me is that it is incredibly poignant and emotive. It helps face those feelings. It helps place you in those shoes. It helps you address aspects of this, even in a very different upbringing. And it speaks to all of those so incredibly well. And yes, it is highly emotionally manipulative. That's the purpose, or part of the purpose of this story. And Ken Liu does an amazing job with this. So one of the things that I find curious is, in Northern Ireland, obviously part of the UK, but Northern Ireland is different to the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland is part of the UK, but it's not England. And having spent time living in England, even something, it's not a separate language, it's the same language. There's a great story about Bram Stoker when he was living and working in England. And he was described by the Tatler magazine as the ginger Irish orangutan with his double entendres, because his accent made the phrase double entendre sound different. And so they were making fun of him. They made fun of his accent. They made fun of the words that he used, because his dialect of English was different to theirs. And you have that same thing here, but obviously magnified 100%, 200, 1,000%, because it's actually a separate language that is a very separate culture, very different culture, that all these things are attenuated and extended. But anyone who's been in a situation where you've been in a different culture can readily identify with so much in this story.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead. A large part of this story is not just about language. Well, I think language is the most important part, because his mother obviously leaves part of herself behind so that she could, through her language, through written language and the letters, and like I said, the mouth and heart. But it's also just general cultural loss. Like one of my favorite parts of the story is like, the mother makes Jack these amazing origami creatures that live and breathe, and they're amazing, right? We all would love to have one. And one of Jack's little terrible friends comes over with his American Star Wars toy and makes fun of it, and he completely loses his sense of joy from things that are literally made from garbage, I suppose, if you want to look at it like that. But so Star Wars and commercialism literally kills the main character's sense of fun and excitement and joy of his cultural identity. So Star Wars.
Star Wars is the worst, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and that's also universal, I think, right? Every child that grows up sees the toys that their peers have and gets a little bit jealous, and the magic goes out of their own stuff because they think that someone else has it better. And I do really like how in this story, the toys that she makes, the origami, the paper menagerie, they get ripped up and battered around, and Ken Liu writes it so that his mom just fixes them every time. She doesn't just discard them and make new ones. The tiger, Lao Hu, is it Lao Hu?
Lao Ho.
I'm just not going to try and pronounce that. The tiger gets torn in half at one point, and she mends it for him. And even after he stops talking to her, she keeps trying to make these gestures to share little pieces of herself with him, and he just rejects it all, and it's deeply heartbreaking.
I love that the tiger is also made of discarded Christmas wrapping.
Yes.
So like this American, very commercialized, like a project that she makes the best of, and tries to get her own, cultural heritage and magic from this new world kind of thing.
And I think that's the nice juxtaposition that we have. She, in some respects, has adapted to the new because here's the new material. It's this beautiful wrapping paper that is considered disposable in a lot of Western societies. And you go, but if you think of Christmas wrapping paper, quite often it is beautifully ornate or wonderfully patterned, and it has all of this beauty. And what do we do with it? Oh, we tear it off the thing, wad it up into a ball, and throw it away. And you go, no, but when you think about it, that is incredibly wasteful. And to look at it and go, but what could I make from this? And her creations then, and it brings in the magic realism of the story. This beautiful origami menagerie that she creates of taking something discarded and making something beautiful out of it. And then, just as you pointed out, the friend comes over with the mass-produced plastic Star Wars toys. And this is the consumerist stuff. No thought has gone into that. That's, I want that toy. Parent buys kid toy. I think as we get older, we start to appreciate more things that are gifted to us that have a personal connection, that have been crafted or tailored to us, rather than they bought us the latest consumer good. But as a child, it's, oh, well, everyone has Star Wars toys. I want that toy. And yet when we compare these two experiences, like asking, like, you know, if someone was going, do you want that toy, or would you like some beautifully made origami figures? And you go, well, I prefer the beautifully made origami figures because there's artistic expression in that. It is a gift from someone. They have made it for you. It is art as opposed to a lump of disposable plastic.
Well, AP, the question for me depends on, is the Star Wars toy in its original packaging or not? Because then I can just leave it on my shelf and never touch it at all.
Or you could sell it and get so many more origami toys.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting piece here, which is the identity of Jack, where he is growing up and he's, his identity is more about his relationship with other people and how people see him. And he's putting a lot of emphasis on that. Whereas the mother, her identity is like she knows who she is. She's lived a lot of experiences and she was so happy to become a mother because she could share her identity and experience with someone. Um, and with the whole thing about the paper origami or the Star Wars toys, it's like you start off, he started off really appreciating it because that's what he knew. And then the Star Wars toy comes in and because Ken Liu specifically says that this kid, his friend, is very popular at school and Jack isn't. And so he sees this as, well, this popular kid really likes this thing and wants to imitate that, whether or not he actually really cares about the toy, because he also did say, like, oh, your toy doesn't really do anything. All it says is the same line, right? But it's because of the person attached to that toy that made it more valuable in his eyes. Um, but if, the same kid, I think his name was like Kevin or something, if Kevin plays that same sort of value on the paper toys, the origami toys, then Jack would have had that same kind of reaction.
It's always
His
Kevin.
name was Mark.
Oh, Mark. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kevin.
No, Mark, Kevin. Yeah, whatever.
I think Kevin
they're
would
all
have
the
been
same.
better.
Jack.
I
Generic.
don't know.
But
There is a quote here that I think struck me as very pertinent to this discussion and critical specifically of American ideals. Sometimes when I came home and saw her tiny body busily moving about in the kitchen, singing a song in Chinese to herself, it was hard for me to believe that she gave birth to me. We had nothing in common. She might as well be from the moon. I would hurry on to my room where I could continue my all-American pursuit of happiness.
Those are my favorite lines.
And it really highlights, I think, throughout the short story collection, Ken Liu, he ponders questions of what it means to be Chinese, what it means to be American, what it means to be someone from both cultures, and pretty harshly criticizes both. This one, he's criticizing individualism, right? Like this idea that what matters most is your own pursuit of happiness, and he doesn't even think about his mom. And later on in her letter, I think she says the deepest sadness in Chinese culture is
growing up to realize.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Growing up to realize that you wish to take care of your parents and realizing that it's too late.
Yep.
I
Is
think
that
one
true,
of the
Vanda?
Is that true?
Like, do people say that?
Well, I personally haven't heard it, but I've
Okay.
also grown up mainly in American society.
But I think one of the things that's interesting about the juxtaposition of the paper menagerie against the Star Wars figures, the sense of wonder and joy and happiness that he had from that. But then with the advent of buying into the Western consumerist model and that cultural framework, that he no longer is happy, that he is pursuing experiences, he's pursuing sensations. But that sense of wonder and joy and happiness disappears from the story for a while. That these are all lesser feelings,
Mhm.
momentary feelings, transitory feelings, ephemeral. Whereas there was real joy in those opening sections about this magical experience. And it's interesting then that when it gets back to the end, he rediscovers that this newfound interest, despite the sadness of that letter and how it ends and the tragedy of this story.
Mhm.
But he rediscovers that interest, that love, that joy and happiness in these things, and it makes him reevaluate where he is because he sees it now with a clearer light. He sees the past slightly more clearly, and I think that was a beautiful moment because it transcends this story and speaks to that as we grow up and we look back on things and we realize the mistakes that we've made. We realize the things that we did not appreciate, the things that we turned our back on, and now it's too late to go back. And it's a great tragedy, the time when he moves in one direction.
Yeah.
There's a good short story about ephemerality in this collection called Mono no Aware. It's pretty good. But back to what Ash said about uh, the pursuit of happiness, because if we look back, the story starts out with Jack thinking, what kind of woman would sell herself in a catalog? The first thing I would think was like, what kind of man buys? But that's what I was thinking. But we could talk about the father later because I think he's a really interesting character. But later on, when he's trying to apply for these colleges and recruiting agencies, his literal words were, "I'm trying to think." Well, I'm paraphrasing, so maybe not literal, but he was thinking, "I'm thinking of the best way that I could lie so that I could get these people to buy me."
Yes.
So
I
he's put it in the
schemed
same.
about how to lie to the corporate recruiters most effectively so that they'd offer to buy me.
And I get the feeling that he honestly has no idea how this relates to what he was thinking about his mother earlier at the time. And that's also like the reason why his mother's there. She's trying to be to find this happiness. Uh, it's just it's good.
And in relation to trying to find happiness, I like how the happy life here is it embraces imperfections and flaws because in the beginning, as full of joy as it is, some of his like the water buffalo, for example, it can't wallow in the soy sauce. Like its legs get soggy and it needs to be rescued. And the
The
animals
shark.
fall apart. The initial shark kind
Yeah.
of just dies, which is quite sad. But when she's telling in the letter, she's telling Jack the story of her life. She recognized that her love story wasn't perfect at all. It was hardly even a love story in many ways because she was bought. She did what she needed to do to get out of a terrible situation, and yet she was able to find happiness in it anyways, and eventually have a son that she really loved, who eventually rejected her, but that's part of the tragedy.
Exactly. I did have a question. So, because in here, sometimes there would be the like pinging of the Chinese words that the mother speaks, and sometimes there would be a translation, but other times there wouldn't be. So I'm curious to know what your reading experience was for that, like when you came across that kind of writing. Like, did you just kind of skim over it? Did you try to look it up? Did it impact your reading?
Um, well, the vast majority of the Chinese phrases, he does supply a translation. The odd phrase here and there, quite often, through context, you know roughly what it means, and so as you're reading down, you can stop and go and look up the exact word, and even that, then you end up with a translation because obviously I don't speak Mandarin and don't know what the real word is and all of the connotations that surround it. But as you read through, all of the all of the English translations are there for the things that you couldn't work out necessarily from context, and all of the other ones you can kind of you start recognizing. So that that certainly wasn't an issue for me. Um,
Did you feel it added to the story and like how you felt about it?
I think it adds a very strong element of verisimilitude, of authenticity to the experience. Because if this is a story about that aspect of the relationship, if her words, the mother's words, had always been rendered as translation, it would minimize that aspect of her in the story. And that is something that is so incredibly important to the story. So by providing her words in Chinese and then a translation to go, I you guys who are reading this, like you probably can't read that, so I'm going to translate it for you. But it allows for that broadening of the experience outside of that very personal one. And this is part of what I was talking about. It is a very inclusive story in that it embraces people from all walks of life and who can identify with this because all of the information is there. You understand what it is like to have this family. You understand what it's like to grow up. You understand what it's like to have disagreements with people, to say things you don't like, to go with the popular crowd and do those things, even though like last week you actually really enjoyed hanging out with your mom or your dad or whoever doing some dumb thing. That was your thing and you loved that. And then one of your friends went, well, that's just stupid. And you're like, well, I'm not doing that anymore. It's stupid. Because you're an idiot when you're a child. Most of us remain that way to my age. One of these days I will grow up and actually become wise. I'm hoping it happens soon, but I'm still an idiot when it comes to so much because our experience is always limited to what we know. And
Yeah.
and that's why reading these things gives you that insight into someone else's experience. Or even if this had nothing to do with Ken Liu's actual life, if this was entirely fabricated, there isn't a shred of anything in this that had anything to do with it. It is such a perfect representation of a life that has these moments that talk to us, that speak to us, that bridge different individual experiences. So, like, I'm not reading this as a biography of Ken Liu. I'm reading
Yeah.
this as an authentic experience that feels incredibly real, even if it is 100% absolute fiction. There is one of the difficulties with fiction is sometimes we sometimes refer to authors as brilliant liars. But the thing is, fiction, the best of fiction is a hidden truth. It's truth packed up in unreality. And that is what is so beautiful about writing like
I agree.
When I read those sections, the untranslated Chinese, it really reminded me of my grandfather
Mhm.
who immigrated from Germany. And sometimes he would just forget that he was that he was in Canada now and he just started speaking German. And so it felt very natural to me reading those sections and very familiar and very, very familial, which I think is very interesting because I did not grow up with any Chinese influence on my life. But at the same time, yes, the growing experience felt very, very relatable.
Yeah.
I oh sorry, Panda.
No, go ahead.
I had a question for the three of you, which is how did you feel about this having that magic realist element to it rather than being a straightforward um, realist story? Having the magical animals, having this element worked into it. Like how did you feel about that in the story?
I was upset that the origami didn't have harder rules to it. You know, I really wish that there had been a 5-10 page section just where the mom explains to her son how this magic works because it's too unbelievable for me to
Oh my
deal with this.
goodness.
Yeah,
Get
it's
out of here.
ridiculous. Yeah, and there was no fight scenes beyond the one where the tiger attacked Mark, which
That
was
was
very
really exciting
disappointing.
though.
That was cool. Um, I admit I was confused at first because I wasn't sure if this was going to turn out into something like, oh, because this is from a child's perspective, it was like his imagination. And like he saw them in his mind as being alive versus them actually being like moving around. But then the more that I read, I was like, oh, okay, so this isn't his imagination. And it is, especially when the mother, like in her letter, confirmed, like, oh, they will stop moving when I'm gone. But, once a year, if you think of me, then they'll come back. Um, and at the beginning, I was like, okay, I'm not really sure where this is going. And then afterwards, I didn't really care. I just thought it was very beautiful and the imagery, like that's the thing about his writing here is that it's so short. He doesn't spend a lot of time describing everything, but I still had these like very vivid images in my mind as I read. And giving the origami movement was a very nice touch.
Um, Couple of things. First of all, magic is cool, so I mean, I'm always happy with them and more stories. Second, what I really like about this, and it wouldn't work in a realist story because the magic, like I said earlier, is kind of a metaphor for his heritage and a metaphor for the language and what his mother leaves behind to him. Though I don't think would be nearly as impactful if it was realist.
Mm.
It did an excellent job of capturing the magic of childhood, I feel. And it
Yeah.
felt, to me, it felt totally natural. Like I didn't even question it for a second, that yes, these little animals were moving around for him. Maybe that's just a result of me reading Calvin and Hobbes too much as a kid, though.
But like Benda said near the end of the story, he literally said to the narrator said to us like, I didn't know if they had stopped moving or they just never had moved, and like he
Hmm.
gave it. But after shortly after that, he tells us no, it is real. It actually happened,
The
and
magic was real all along.
exactly
Yeah.
Now,
the magic was our mother who died along the way.
Oh no, don't
oh,
don't.
that's in bad taste. But one of the things I thought that was really interesting about this is that it works as yes, there's literally magical origami animals, that you can read it at that literal level, that surface level. But it also works very much in terms of that standing in as that metaphor for the sense of wonder, the sense of joy, the that sense of innocence that he leaves behind, he jettisons, he gets that connection to that culture because he rejects it. There is no more magic. So it I think it works really really well as that symbol. In addition to yeah, you can read it. You can read it both ways. That
Hmm.
you don't you can actually hold both mutually exclusive ideals in your head at the same time and just flip backwards and forwards between them. I I think that is the strength of this. That you don't have to go, oh no, have the debate about is it actual magic or is it all in his head? That doesn't matter. The fact that both can be true and both can be true simultaneously is, I think,
Hmm.
one of the great techniques that gets pulled off in this story because there is that wonderful ambiguity and it ties in so much with that sense of childish imagination. The idea of the imaginary friend, of taking your toys when you were little and you would play with them and they would, oh, they're having a fight. And in your head, you were creating this epic battle or the little cars they were racing around and it was, they're going over the rug and you're imagining oh, and they have to swerve around this. It's all about this imagination. So we can so deeply connect with that and understand that as a point. And on the other hand, you can go, but it's also, as you've pointed out, this connection to this other culture. And rather than the um, mysticized for the sake of making exotic, it's actually, yes, it is unknown, but it's made beautiful and wondrous and comforting. And
Yeah.
that's a very different juxtaposition and contrast that's being made than the usual way that a number of Western authors have portrayed the Orient and orientalizing characters for a sake like that, or cultures like that. Of it is this, oh look, isn't it weird? That's not the sense from this. This is something beautiful and mystical and deep with a history and a tradition. And it it is such a beautiful symbol. Working it in with the origami itself is a wonderful expression of all of that, at least to me.
Yeah, I agree. I did really enjoy the pacing of the story. I mean, it is a short story, so there's not that much time, right, to explain everything. And I felt that Ken Liu did a good job spending time in the right places, and he was very good about ending the like paragraphs. He would like end with poignant sentences. So there was one that you already said, um, your name says Harrison on
Oh
it, but I
no.
call you Ash.
Yeah, let me quickly
So I'm
rename
just like,
myself again.
who do I call you?
There you
Um,
go.
Thank you. And there was the one about, the pursuit of American happiness, but then there was another one where it was like, she died when my plane was somewhere over Nevada. And it was just like, that leading up, that build up to it, and then he just lets it out, and it's just like, oh, that's a punch. And then there was another one where it was like, I went to the computer to check the internet. Today was Qingming, which was like, oh, look at the Day of the Dead, right? So I thought he did a really good job in terms of constructing the story and the pacing.
And he's very good at delivering maximum emotional damage with
Mm-hmm.
all of the, especially near the end, because he spends a relatively long amount of time emphasizing how disinterested he was in his mother's health. And then also how much she's struggling, because clearly he's writing this later. He's having a very hard time forgiving himself, I think. And so he's definitely framing things in a way that's not flat, as the least amount of flattering to himself as possible, I think. But I also really appreciate how he characterizes the mom and the dad, never mentioning their names, of course, because moms and dads don't have names. But there's a scene early on where some neighborhood women are visiting, and they gather around Jack and ask him, like, why does he look like a sorry about this, chink? And then, even though she doesn't understand the language, his mom just kind of comes in there to protect him. She puts herself in there and just kind of like smiles politely at them, so they stop harassing her son. And I thought that was a really beautiful little moment.
Yeah.
I was impressed with the complexity of the dad, or the complexity that came out in such a short amount of time. Because, like I said, the story starts out with the son blaming his mother for selling herself in a magazine. And when I was thinking that, I wasn't thinking, well, blame her. I was thinking, what kind of man buys a woman in a magazine? Like, this is messed up. And then later on, these racist women who say terrible racist things about his kid are also thinking the same thing about the dad, which makes you think, maybe it's a little more complicated if these old terrible women are thinking that. And then we find out that, like, he was actually a lot, like, he held her hand, he kissed her, he cared about her in a certain way. And maybe he wasn't the best father, but he was a father. And he, even though he was lied to about like her English ability or what her interests are, like everything was a lie, right? He still took the time to pay for a translator so that he could talk to her, and like there was at least some sort of connection there. I'm not saying the guy's a good guy or that it's okay to buy women on the internet, but it was more complicated than that.
Just so you know, this video has now been demonetized.
Oh no.
Oh, because of me?
No, because of the reference to buying women on the internet.
That's fair.
I thought it was
Well, you
from
can
the
just
racial
bleep
slur.
that.
Yeah.
No, it like I make money from this channel.
Philip's making all the money.
But I think the portrayal of the father is interesting because in a lot of discourse, we set people up as paragons, as these, someone is either good or they are evil, binary states. And yet every time we dig deeper into it, people have flaws. And we see this, Jack's exploration of his own flaws, which, is a major focus of the story. Then the complexity and the strengths and weaknesses, or the flaws and good parts of his mother that are explored. Same with the father. That these are complex constructions, because that's what humans are. Humans are balls of contradiction. We all have good points and bad points, and that's something that, again, I think adds to the believability of the story, because it's not just the brilliant dad and the terrible mom. It's not the amazing mom and the terrible dad. They aren't pushed to extremes. They are made real because they're made fragile and flawed and raw and human. And this is something I think when we read a lot of genre fiction, particularly fantasy fiction, the creation of character there can sometimes be very, very different because they're in a different world. And although we try to think of even our favorite ones, oh, isn't that an amazing character? They don't quite feel as real as this, because this is something that feels so incredibly grounded in our experience. Whereas with fantasy, we're always that one step removed. When it's on a secondary world and they're an elf, I don't care how cool the elf is or how detailed the story is about the elf. There's always going to be that additional point of separation because it is different. But here we see those flaws explored in a way where we can extrapolate from that quite readily because we understand the nuances of the world. We can only understand secondary worlds with the information that we're given. And extrapolating from that is always dodgy at best. It's a best guess. Whereas here we have so much more context and cultural knowledge that adds to our understanding of the words on the page. So we start seeing the implications and the subtext behind it. We see this bigger picture. When those three women are standing around, we can all create in our head, even if it's a slightly different vision, we know exactly what sort of women these are. We can hear them. We can hear the comments, the whispers, the little asides, the snide remarks, the haughty looks that are given. We know that because we've experienced them in our lives. And so it doesn't need to be extravagantly detailed in the story because Ken Liu knows that we know them.
That's a
And
very good point. Yeah. I actually think it's interesting because I really didn't, I mean, I don't think you're meant to like the father character. Um, and he doesn't have that much page time, um, which I think makes sense because the focus isn't really on him. Um, but the relationship between the father and the son was interesting in that it seemed like he oftentimes took the side of the son more than the mother. And that's kind of telling. I mean, part of it could be like when you become a parent, like no matter how much you love your spouse, like your child, you're always going to have a stronger like emotional attachment to the child and you want to protect the child. Um, shaking your head.
That's not true.
Well,
listen,
I'm
we all
saying like,
know. Oh, sorry, Panda. As I was about to say, we all know that the reason people have kids is to have spare organs walking around that are easy access.
Also,
It's
farm labor.
chimney
farm
sweeps.
labor.
It's our source
Yeah.
of chimney sweeps. Isn't that right? Isn't that
The,
why
chil-
everyone?
the children yearn for the mines.
Oh dear.
That's how I announced the birth of my son, actually.
What?
Like my spare organs have arrived.
Oh my God. Well, you may not feel that way. A lot of parents feel that way. So I did think it was interesting because he also, this is where he made me really mad, the father character. He said to his wife, like, well, you knew coming here, like, you knew what that would be like. I'm like, excuse me? No. Like, she probably thought that you would be more supportive. as a spouse. But anyway,
And
so
given the upbringing that we know she had, how would she know? She had no experience of anything outside China her entire life, and her experience of things inside China were vastly different. And then this man comes along and he says nice things about her that she's probably never heard in her life before. And understandably, she's pretty smitten, I think. And yeah, she comes over and this is a completely different culture. How could she know that this would be how things were? Ridiculous.
I read that very differently. So that scene at the table where he talks to his wife and he's like, you knew this was coming. Like she'd already been there for years, and their son was at an age where he was already going to school and he was having trouble integrating, I suppose, probably a better word, with the people around there. And she's been there for years. She's had trouble doing this, and they know the issues that a lot of I guess minority children might have in a different country. And so, like, how could she not know that that would be an issue? Because it's been an issue for her, and it's slowly been becoming an issue ever since the beginning. It wasn't something that like he was implying that she should have known even before she came to the United States when they got married. It's something that they'd been preparing for and anticipating because, of course, that's going to happen.
that's a fair reading of it. It doesn't make me like him more, because to it's a partnership thing. And for him to also tell her, like, kind of almost reprimanding her for it is how I felt. Um, that to me that's what made me upset.
I also get a sense that he's also ashamed from this. He probably feels um, uh, shame about himself and also about his wife. Shame that he would need to go and get a catalog mail order bride, I think they were called, and also shame that his wife isn't able to interact with anybody basically besides him and his son.
I think also that he's probably shamed because he knows part of his son's problems are his fault. Like he gives like once in the story half-hearted attempts at trying to get his son to respect his mother, but he ultimately gives up because I think yeah, it's shame there.
Well, that was the paragraph I was just trying to find on the screen. It's, you shouldn't treat your mother that way, Dad said. But he couldn't look me in the eyes as he said it. Deep in his heart, he must have realized that it was a mistake to have tried to take a Chinese peasant girl and expect her to fit in the suburbs of Connecticut.
Yeah.
And there's so much. One of the things I find fascinating about this, and this particular discussion that we're having, is how people interpret things and the assumptions we then make about how other people interpret things. That, I read that Ash, Panda, we all read it in our own way. And of course, our assumption is that's how everyone reads it. And yet we see this time and time again. Every time we talk about books, when we talk about, a scene or how to interpret a character or things that are happening on the page. And we can all agree on the same facts, but we sometimes disagree with how we interpret it. So the facts remain the same, but the emphasis, the emphasis that we place on those different things, how we interpret those different things, how we gel them together to build out the bigger picture, all of that background stuff that goes on, that is going to differ. And suddenly, when we have that expectation, even if you said, well, you knew this was coming, you should have expected this. It's because he did. His assumption was, and that's one way to look at it. Because he expected it, he expected that she expected it. Because it was obvious to him that this was coming, therefore it should be obvious to her. How many times have we had that moment in our lives where we've been talking to a friend or a family member or a loved one or a partner where we go, but why did you think I was going to do it? I said I was going to do this thing. Why did you? Because this breakdown in communication, and it's not trying to hide something from the other person, but we sometimes forget that they, A, don't have access to our brains, B, don't have access to our experiences and how we interpret the reality that we live in, and C, that really sometimes we don't say the things that we thought we said. And that can lead to misunderstanding. So you're not deliberately trying to lie to the person or hide something from them or do something to annoy them. But we do live in separate realities, and it's trying to bridge that to find those levels of communication. And so much of the story is about different ways to communicate, communicating love through the gift of those paper animals. That this is a communication, a showing of that love and affection that the mother has for the son, but also the pride and joy she has in her culture and the things that she knows and she understands and makes her unique and that she can bring to the world. There's joy in what she does there. And so these gestures have multiple meanings and multiple interpretations. And again, you can hold, because it's fiction, this is the joy of fiction, you can hold mutually exclusive readings in your head at the same time. You can read it in both ways to see how it changes an interpretation or an aspect of the story. And that's why you can read and reread things over and over again. It's not about this is the answer. This is the great thing about understanding, instead of authorial intent, the whole argument about death of the author that is elevating different reader interpretations, is it increases the validity and flexibility of different ways of interpreting the text without saying, no, the text is meant to mean X. This is what it means. And as long as what you're drawing from is you're drawing from a relatively logical construction of the information you're given, that is the pattern that you have created in your head.
I think that's a very good point, and also explains why I interpreted it the way I did, because I come from like both the mother and the father side, identity of my child and maybe his struggles and how he's going to handle these things growing up in another country from his parents, is something that I think about a lot. It's something I try to talk to my partner with a lot, and she sometimes doesn't even give it two things, and I'm just like, well, how could you not think about these kind of things, you know?
So about that particular section, I brushed her hand away. I'm fine. Speak English! Exclamation mark. We get that. Now, do you interpret that as him angry, or like how you interpret the exclamation mark is how you're reading his phrase? But then when you get and he says, "I was shouting." Speak English to him. Dad said to mom, "You knew this was going to happen someday." Full stop. What did you expect? Question mark. That because punctuation it gives us some information, sentence, question, and depending on language and culture, how you then hear a question, maybe with the raised note at the end, that uplift at the end. But an exclamation mark, we realize, means something else. But because the question mark doesn't give us what tone does the father say this, that is where your personal interpretation of the phrase is coming in. So we can all agree, he said, "What did you expect?" But this is why we have this divergence, because the tone is not made clear. This is allowing the reader freedom to create the interpretation. Whereas if it had said, "What did you expect?" Dad said angrily, that's nailing it down to one thing. That is focusing your attention on this is how it must be. And this sometimes, this is a difficulty in trying to explain to people, the difference between showing and telling. Telling would have been putting the angrily in there, nailing down the meaning so there is no other way to interpret it. Showing is creating the thing and allowing you to see it. Because even then, I was shouting. Not I was shouting angrily. It was I was shouting. There are other reasons why he could be shouting. He could be distraught. He could be upset. He could be hurt and speak English, but he's doing it that way. And that's the exclamation. Now, that's not how I read it, because I brushed her hand away, pushed her away. Mm-hmm. And so that gesture, followed by the exclamation point of speak English, that's what gives me the sense of his conveyed emotion. But again, it's not he slapped her hand away. he brushed her hand away. It's a more gentle motion. So there's still ambiguity being worked in so that we can build our understanding of the scene from it.
Yeah,
I
and I do think that because of my interpretation of he brushed her hand away, it's the he exclaimed, I speak English. Because of my interpretation of that is negative, that carried over to reading what the father said because my emotions were heightened and I was getting defensive, right? And therefore, my interpretation of the father's question became more negative.
That's perfect. I mean, that's exactly what I'm sure if Ken Liu ever watched this video, he's going, yes, that's what I wanted you to think. Oh, I got her. Because this is what authors want. They want us to be emotionally, well, for something like this, especially, they want you to be emotionally engaged in their writing, to get something from it, to feel something from it. And with something like this, that makes it more vivid. It makes it more powerful because you have that reaction. And it's the great joy of literature. But now, unpacking that, can you see how someone else could interpret it slightly differently? And it gives you that more analytical way of looking at it. And that's part of the joy that I have of, basically taking authors' work apart and poking it and prodding it and seeing what all the bits are and then going, can I put it back? Oh, I've missed a bit. Oh, that's never going to fit together again. But that's part of the joy that I have. There are so many different ways that authors can achieve these things that I love studying it. I love seeing it. And there are a huge range, depending on the text, a huge range of different ways that you can interpret it. But then there's some that you look at and you go, that interpretation, I don't know where you're getting that from. That's radically outside of the information here. It's not that every interpretation is always valid.
Right.
We talk about a valid reader's experience, and that's because some of them are invalid. People can misread. But as you explained, like looking at that, understanding how you got to that sense, how you felt that emotion, you go, yeah, I can see exactly how this worked. And then you take a step back and go, outside of my emotion, looking at it, can I see a different way that it could be interpreted? Is there a softer way? And how much of this is it because it's a resonance with me, what I remember, what I experience? How much of it is because of how I'm empathizing with the characters? How much of it is actually in the text? And how much of it am I projecting onto it? And these are all really important questions. Projection is so often ignored in how people interpret scenes. The projection of our own experiences, our own emotions, what we think. A heroic character strides onto the page and they do some heinous act. But because we know they're a heroic character, we see all of their actions in the best possible light. And we make excuses for them. And we do all of these things. And it's because of the complexity of this relationship. Sorry,
And that
this was me
happens.
rambling.
No, that happens in real life. Like, scientific studies have shown that for people who are considered as beautiful, good looking, oftentimes they're given, the benefit of the doubt. And then the not as good looking people, oftentimes people are interpreting their emotions or their, motivations as being more negative. So, no, that's a real world application.
And I
And
think we see brilliant aspects of this on social media where someone goes, oh, this was the joke I had with, my brother the other day. And it's because, obviously they have a long-standing relationship. This is the joke. You are a terrible human being. How dare you do that? Because these other people who don't know you or don't know your brother, don't understand, they're mapping an entirely different thing onto it because they don't know the situation. It's, oh, how could you treat your spouse like that or your partner that way? And you're like, dude, like you know that if she didn't want me to do that, she would just kick my ass. This is a long-standing joke between her and I, and she is more than capable of telling me to sit the F down and shut up. Like if she didn't want to put up with it, but then people will go, oh no, but you're doing, and they project a lot of these things because it's not knowing the nuances and instances of it. And again, we we see bad behavior being masked as, oh no, but we've always done it this way. And again, it's messy, it's complicated. And that's literature. Literature is a slightly simplified form of life.
And add to that the bias I think everyone has towards whoever is telling the story at the time, which I think Jack in this story battles against that pretty ferociously. Because, for example, when after Mark comes over and whatever happens, and then he says, and then there was 2 weeks at school that I don't even want to think about. And he could have portrayed some of that, made himself a bit more sympathetic to the reader. Maybe kids were beating him up, maybe they're shoving him in lockers, maybe they're calling him horribly racist names to cause all this, but he kind of glosses over that and immediately just focuses on how he's now mistreating his mother. Right. And he doesn't convey any of the, I'm sure, emotional turmoil that was going on when, for example, he was shutting away the paper menagerie. When they broke out and then he just put them back in a box, he narrates it. And I think this is something Ken Liu does very well. He lets the actions stand on their own. He doesn't say, I put them away sadly, like you were saying, Hippie. He just shoves them in a box and he puts them away. And at the end of the story, I think he doesn't say how he was feeling at all. He just couldn't meet the woman who read them the letter in the eyes. And then he does a series of actions. He writes the Chinese character for love over and over again on the tiger, and then he refolds the tiger and he goes home.
And again, that ambiguity that gets created of stating what happened, it creates a sense of vulnerability. It creates a sense of honesty, because if someone wasn't being honest, why would they tell us these things? They would change it. They would tell us the story in the best possible light for them. That's what we expect. So when someone reveals something that they did badly, they can almost are confessional about it. That we then believe it all the more because, well, they're being vulnerable. They're showing their faults and their flaws. And that's one of the ways that you create this feeling of verisimilitude, of truth, of authenticity to the story, because it makes it feel more real. Because why would the narrator tell us all these bad things?
And as well, he's not telling us how to feel about the story as he's telling it. He doesn't ever say that I was a horrible kid to my mom, or contrast, I was a great kid to my mom and she just didn't understand me. He's just narrating the events as happened, which makes it feel more authentic, even though, of course, there is a lot of ways to slant the narrative, even when you do stuff like this. And it happens, for example, in history texts all the time.
Bingo.
Did somebody take a shot? He talked about history.
He talks about
I've heard verisimilitude, history. You mentioned Bram Stoker. Just got everything.
Oh, hang on a sec. Diegetic?
You haven't said diegetic yet.
Bingo! Like, there we go. We filled in the bingo card. Well, listen, unless there's something else that you desperately want to talk about this, I think we've had a really productive and engaging discussion about this, about not only the specifics of this brilliant story that people should read, but some more general points, some different ways of interpreting it. This is the kind of fun discussion that I love about literature. That it's not just about, oh, did you like that thing? Oh yeah, it was great. It's talking about our responses and how those responses were created, and the techniques that an author used, and how they created resonances. It's the entire package. So I just wanted, do you have any further points you'd like to discuss?
I have one more. on the note of history, I really like how deftly he weaves in the historical events, not just in this, but in every story in this collection. He provides a very limited perspective and a very short perspective of two very important events in Chinese history, the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution. And it adds the verisimilitude, and it provides a perspective on the history that most people in the West, I don't think, get. or seek out. And he deals with this more extensively in other stories in this collection, like most importantly, I think, The Man Who Ended History.
A documentary.
But, yeah. And it's something that I think sets him at a cut above a lot of other authors who think of history in a completely different way.
That gets me really excited to read the Dandelion Dynasty, his epic fantasy series, which when I finish Malazan, the main series, that's what I'm gonna pick up. But also during this discussion, I mean, like, oftentimes I do feel like Curran and I, we read the same text, but we just have different interpretation, and we'll just, fight about it on the podcast.
A lot.
Isn't that because Huron's always wrong?
He usually is, yeah.
I didn't say it.
He's a filthy, jagged apologist.
Listen, Malik Rel the Merciful is misunderstood. So thank you so much for coming by and spending this time with me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a
Love
treat
the
for
talk.
us.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to this for months. It's just making time for it.
Oh yeah, I've been bugging them about it a lot. I think Kieran was too. Just, when are we going to talk to AP? We said we're going to talk to AP. Come on, let's do it. Panda was like, no, I have a life. I'm busy.
Well, and for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.